Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nathan Provost. I'm with the Emerging Civil War, as well as the Unfiltered Historian, and currently I'm working on my doctorate under Dr. Stephen Woodworth here at Liberty. And I'm very excited to share this presentation with you. It covers my part of my dissertation topic of Cold Harbor, but it goes into a larger theme around the preservation of earthworks during the Overland Campaign in the American Civil War. And typically I like to call this campaign something like the American Odyssey, especially if we view it from Grant's perspective, Ulysses S. Grant. I feel like that's a good name. But needless to say, I think it's important before I jump into the entrenchments and preservation of the battlefields itself. I feel it best that I actually cover a bit of background information here on this subject. The Overland Campaign itself, it's going to last roughly a month and a half. I characterize it as going from May 5th to June 18th. They're at the final stages of the assaults on Petersburg. This will ultimately lead up to the Petersburg campaign, as well as the Appomattox campaign. And of course, here you can see Ulysses S. Grant waiting for the surrender terms from Robert E. Lee. In this image, and this, of course, occurred near Appomattox. And this map is created here, so that way you guys get a good understanding of the geography and where these battles took place. They are located in Eastern Virginia. They are located close to the cities of Fredericksburg and Culpeper. And ultimately, these battles, they're not just going to last one day, they're going to last many days. Two battles in particular are actually going to last something like 2 weeks, both at Spotsylvania Courthouse as well as Cold Harbor. And my focus primarily is on that Cold Harbor battlefield as well. So unfortunately, I can't be with you to walk you through and tour these battlefields with me, but I wanted to give us an understanding of what these battlefields feel like, who they are run by, their significance, and what you would typically find there. So when you first enter the battlefield of the Wilderness, it is not far from the city of Fredericksburg, as I mentioned, but the National Park Service currently runs it. Before the National Park Service, the Civilian Conservation Corps actually attempted to preserve the area, and they primarily preserved the area where Gouverneur Warren and John Sedgwick were attempting to attack the Confederate left flank. That's when they pushed into them, and it was a back and forth fight between them. And of course, there are these stops, as you see here on my left. This is an image of me at the Wilderness Battlefield. I stopped at Grant's headquarters. The irony of this place is actually this place where they put the marker for his headquarters is actually very, very far from where his original headquarters was. In fact, if you go further back, there's actually a neighborhood that has been built up near the Wilderness Battlefield, and they believe his original headquarters is now built where an O'Reilly's Auto Part Center is. So if you actually want to gain a feel of the battlefield and the breastworks that were built in the heat of the moment under fire, you actually have to go deep inside where the wilderness is. And that's ultimately what I decided to do one morning. And the best time of year to actually go look at these fortifications is actually around late fall, when it's starting to get a little bit cold because the leaves are on the ground. You can see these entrenchments a little bit better. There's not a lot of growth in that area. And so here I took an image of where some breastworks were actually dug. And these breastworks here are original. So they are not preserved by the National Park Service. They're not preserved by the Civilian Conservation Corps. I just happened to stumble upon this as I was making my way through the wilderness. And this is going to be a common theme throughout the Overland Campaign as we continue to go through each one of these battlefields. Because these battles are not necessarily these open ground, men marching on each other battles. It is find contact, dig in, stay there, assault each other until it is ruthlessly bloody, and then Grant will ultimately decide that he does not want to expend the lives of his soldiers, and so he will flank left. So that is typically the theme of the campaign itself. It will rack up tremendous casualties. The entrenchments, the fortifications are going to become extremely complex, as you'll see throughout these battlefields. And these are images that I have personally taken of these battlefields that I've gone on. So here we actually go to the Spotsylvania battlefield, and in this, I'm actually going to start in the bottom right corner here. This is actually where the mule shoe, or what was a salient, was originally placed. This is where a major attack occurred against Confederate lines, and there were thousands of casualties on both sides, but Union forces broke through this Confederate horseshoe entrenchment because it was vulnerable, and ultimately it forced the Confederates back roughly about an entire football length back to entrenchments that they had previously built. So all this did was, for the Federals, was hold more ground. But the Union will continuously build more fortifications. They'll try to outflank them many different times. If you look here in the top right, these are Union entrenchments as well. Again, I had to get off the beaten path in order to go and find these. Luckily, I had a local historian with me to go and look for these. And you could think of these entrenchments as something like the capital letter E, where you have one line and then three perpendicular lines attaching to it. So you have a defensive line, and then you have guys feeding into it. You have guys feeding in supplies to the men that are already stationed there in that line. Again, this is not preserved by the National Park Service, nor was it preserved by the Civilian Conservation Corps. However, in the bottom right, as we previously talked about, there is actually a monument you can see in the bottom left. This area is very well preserved by the National Park Service, and it was also preserved by the Civilian Conservation Corps, and they've done a really good job trying to put some earthworks back up to show what it was like in the time when Federal soldiers and Confederate soldiers were actually in that position. Then finally here, off to the left, again, this is me out in a more wooded area off the beaten path from where the National Park Service is upkeeping the area. And again, me and my partner, we actually came across some entrenchments here as well. And these are original, they're not preserved. Oftentimes, these breastworks, you will find many of them, many that still are there, that were built back in 1864. North Anna is a story of entrenchments, and this is one of the very first battlefields I went to as I was studying the Overland Campaign. I was very fortunate to work with Chris Mikowski. He is a historian. He's written a number of books. He's actually written about the Battle of North Anna. And this area as well, this house is recently being upkept by the American Battlefield Trust. They have taken over this property and they want to restore it. to what it would look like back then. But ultimately, these steps, Robert E. Lee sat on these steps. But this is a battle that represents what happened when you didn't entrench. This was a battle where Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia, they did not entrench their men here, and Union forces were able to break their forces. They won a couple of battles in the beginning stages, and Robert E. Lee almost lost his life sitting on that step as Union artillery was firing on that position, and a cannon just missed Robert E. Lee as he was sitting there. So the war would have most likely drastically changed had Robert E. Lee just been a couple more inches to his right. But Lee realized pretty quickly he needed to figure out a way to stop this Union advance onto his position. So he decided to make an inverted V. The apex of the V was actually located on a river, and it was impossible for Grant to attack either one of these positions, and it also made the Union Army vulnerable to attack. And these two images on the right are actually the apex of what was that inverted V. And so you can actually see, if you think about the way that we originally were looking at those field fortifications at the Battle of the Wilderness, they're now becoming more advanced. And especially we saw that there at Spotsylvania Courthouse, and now we're seeing more of that here. The defenses, they're actually getting a lot higher. They're digging deeper because they realize they need to protect their position. Otherwise, they will be forced to retreat. The Confederates will be forced to retreat back to Richmond, and Grant will be able to successfully besiege them there. And the whole time, Grant is not trying to get to Richmond. And it took Lee until the Battle of North Anna to realize this. Grant was after Lee's army. And that is why fortifications were playing a huge role, because Lee knew that if he fortified himself, he could inflict more casualties on the attacker. And that is ultimately what is happening. However, Lee was also looking for opportunities to take the offensive and to retake what we consider the military initiative, or the ability to make your enemy move to your movements. They are reacting to you. At that point in time, Lee was having to react to all of Grant's movements. The only way Lee could take that back was by attacking him. Well, unfortunately for Lee, Grant was doing the exact same thing. He would have his men advance and then entrench. So if Lee were to attack him, they would suffer the same consequences. So Lee only found very, very few opportunities to actually attack the Army of the Potomac. Here is also another little known battle, the Battle of Totopotomoy Creek. Try saying that 10 times fast and you will have your tongue twisted. But here, unfortunately, I was not able to spend much time because it was this building here was under construction, and they also cut off some areas that I was not allowed to go back into. But again, this is a similar battle where you have Confederate forces entrenching on the other side of a creek, making it even more difficult for Union forces to move across the creek and then attack a fortified position. Confederate forces are going to find the same thing near a place called Bethesda Church, where they will also find Union forces well entrenched and driven back. The defense here is going to be very, very important. And that will speak loudly at a place called Cold Harbor. Maybe some of you know a little bit about Cold Harbor. Cold Harbor is called Lee's last great field victory. However, I tend to disagree with the notion, because this is one battle that lasted 2 weeks. That engagement only lasted 1 day. The battle raged on for another week. But here again, you can see the earthworks that have been preserved by the National Park Service. And these here are very, very complex now. At this point in time, you actually have mortar shelters as well as entrenchments, because Grant came up with a very innovative idea of possibly besieging an open area and besieging an army in that open area. It wasn't a city he was besieging. He was trying to actually besiege an army. So this is something that is similar to that of what we see in World War I with trench warfare, where you literally see lines attempting to outmaneuver the other by just simply digging in and trying to get around the other person's flank. Well, unfortunately for Grant, he ran out of room to flank because he hit the Chickahominy River. And he will have to ultimately figure out a way to take his 100,000 men out of these entrenchments and then maneuver across this river down to Petersburg. Miraculously, he will do it. But I did also want to mention again the losses that came from the Overland Campaign. This is actually an image of a national cemetery in Fredericksburg. It's near Mary's Heights, but many, many soldiers who are buried here also were victims of the Overland Campaign and that deadly trench warfare that took place. Confederate soldiers between May 5th and June 18th, they lost roughly 39,000. Union forces, they are going to lose roughly 66,000. So you can tell just from those numbers that the losses here are incredible and they've never been seen before in military history. So just to understand how amazing and powerful these earthworks are is something that the National Park Service is trying to preserve. And it was also something the Civilian Conservation Corps was trying to preserve as well, but they still have a very long way to go. The only section at Cold Harbor that is still preserved is where 6th Corps actually stood. And just to give you an idea, the Union 2nd Corps, the Union 18th Corps, the Union 5th Corps, and the Union 9th Corps all took part in this battle. So only one corps' position is actually preserved. And finally, I wanted to pull this, this image here. This comes from the United States Army Corps of Engineers in 1908. You can actually find this in the Library of Congress. But they did a miraculous job of drawing the entrenchments and abatis in covered ways during the Petersburg, during the unorthodox siege of Petersburg, as Grant continued to outflank the city of Petersburg to force Robert E. Lee to flee farther west and what will become the Appomattox Campaign. But originally, when Grant arrived on June 15th, it looked like they were going to automatically take the city of Petersburg because there was only 2,500 Confederate soldiers stationed in the city, and Union forces had roughly 15,000 men there. So Beauregard, who was protecting the city, was planning on retreating to Richmond. Luckily for Confederate forces, the Union general that was in command June 15th actually hesitated, William Baldy Smith, and decided not to attack any further because of the entrenchments. These entrenchments were massive, and he had no idea what lay on the other side of them. And they had just experienced a terrible slaughter at Cold Harbor, and he was afraid the same thing would happen here. Unfortunately, he would be wrong, and this would lead to more assaults on June 16th, June 17th, and June 18th. And then Grant will give the order to dig in, and we are going to envelop or cut off all routes into Petersburg. So what's the purpose? Why did I take you through these battles? Why did I talk about these entrenchments? Why did I bring up the National Park Service and the Civilian Conservation Corps? Well, the purpose of this presentation was to present these entrenchments the way that they have been left behind. Many of them have been untouched. Many of them have been unfound. Many of them are still looking to be discovered. These entrenchments played a very, very important role in the tactics, in the military decisions, as well as the protection of these soldiers that took part in this very bloody campaign. And I think it's important for the National Park Service as well as the public to understand why these entrenchments need to be preserved, because they tell a bigger story than just simply an area that was dug into so some soldiers could survive. This entire campaign was based upon them. And so as I took you through all these battlefields, you can tell how often I would go off the beaten path to go and find them, because they need to be found, and it gives us a better understanding of the Overland campaign, as well as Grant's decision-making and Lee's decision-making. I really hope you enjoyed this tour. Please, please, please let me know if you have any questions. I'll be happy to answer them in the comments. Thank you so much.